Still taking public transport, my mother. Brenda taunted, her voice carrying over the Thanksgiving dinner table. Your sister has 3 cars, you know. My father Warren smirked over his sweet tea, muttering about how pathetic it was that I was still hustling on the streets at my age. I did not argue. I simply pushed back my tailored sleeve and silently checked my diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe watch. Right on cue, my phone buzzed loudly on speaker. It was the regional airport dispatcher. Ma'am, your private helicopter fleet is 3 minutes out. Where would you like us to land? Brenda's crystal wine glass slipped from her hand, shattering into pieces on the hardwood floor. Her face went completely pale. If you have ever had your own family treat you like a peasant, while you were silently building a kingdom, hit like and subscribe. Because the karma they faced did not fall from the sky, it came straight from my bank account. My name is Keisha, and I am 35 years old. To understand exactly how I brought my toxic family to their knees, you have to go back exactly 1 month before that Thanksgiving helicopter landing. It was a typical Sunday afternoon in Atlanta. I was driving my understated sedan toward my parents' sprawling brick house in the upscale suburbs. I purposely kept a low profile. Nobody in my family knew the reality of my life. The air inside the house was heavy with the familiar smell of collard greens, baked macaroni, and fried chicken, but the atmosphere was anything but welcoming. I should have known better than to accept a sudden invitation to Sunday dinner after church. We had not spoken in weeks, but Brenda had insisted I come over, claiming she wanted all her girls under one roof for a blessing. I arrived in a simple beige sweater and slacks, intentionally dressing down to avoid any unwanted questions. My sister Dominique was already there, sitting on the velvet sofa like royalty. She was intentionally flashing her Spelman College alumni ring every single time she picked up her glass of water. That heavy gold ring was a glaring, constant reminder of the education I was brutally denied. We sat down at the large mahogany dining table, and the familiar interrogations began before the plates were even passed. Warren cleared his throat and looked at me with that signature disappointment he wore, like a badge of honor. So, Keisha, are you still working that little dispatch job? He asked, his tone dripping with condescension. You are pushing 35. You need to start thinking about a real career and stop playing around. Look at Preston here. He gestured proudly to Dominique's husband. Preston was a white finance bro who always looked at me like I was something he had scraped off his expensive loafers. My parents worshipped him because they thought his auto dealership brought prestige to the family name. Preston runs a legitimate luxury business, Warren continued. Dominique has that winner's mindset. She aligned herself with success. I kept my face perfectly still, slicing into my chicken. Hearing my father praise Dominique's winner's mindset took everything in me not to laugh bitterly. What he called a winner's mindset was actually the result of the ultimate family betrayal. When we were 18, our grandmother passed away and left a substantial college fund meant to be split evenly between both of us. But my parents controlled the accounts. Instead of splitting it, they drained every single cent of my inheritance to buy Dominique a brand new luxury car as a graduation present. They claimed she needed to keep up appearances at Spelman. When I confronted them about my tuition money, they coldly told me to figure it out myself. I ended up dropping out of college because I could not afford the tuition fees. I spent my 19th year sleeping on a freezing bus bench, working overnight shifts, while they threw lavish parties to celebrate Dominique's sorority rush. I survived that betrayal, but the scar it left was permanent. Preston chuckled at my father's praise, leaning back in his chair and adjusting his expensive silk tie. Actually, Warren, it is funny you bring up business, he said, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from his leather briefcase and dropping them right in the middle of the dining table. Keisha, we brought you here today because I have an opportunity for you. I put my fork down. An opportunity from Preston usually meant someone else was about to lose money. My dealership is expanding, he continued, but we are restructuring some of our capital. I am securing a massive bridge loan to cover some temporary liquidity issues. The bank just needs a secondary, clean corporate entity to act as collateral to push the underwriting through. I did some digging and saw your little LLC is technically still active. Brenda leaned forward, her eyes wide with manufactured maternal warmth. This is your chance to finally be part of a real enterprise, Keisha. Preston is willing to let you co-sign on his business loans. It is the least you can do for the family since you have never really contributed much else. I looked at the papers, then at Preston. You want me to put my company up as collateral for your failing auto lot? I asked, my voice perfectly level. Preston scoffed, rolling his eyes. Failing is a strong word for someone who just coordinates truck drivers for a living. I am offering to legitimize your little street hustle. You should be grateful a real businessman is willing to attach his name to whatever it is you do in that tiny office of yours. Dominique chimed in, her voice echoing her husband's arrogance. Exactly, Keisha. Preston is throwing you a bone. You do not even have a college degree. If this goes well, he might even give you a job washing cars at the dealership so you can stop struggling. The sheer audacity of the request hung in the air. They thought I was a struggling, desperate woman who would jump at the chance to serve them. They had no idea that my little LLC they were mocking was actually the holding company for Omnifleet, a $2.5 billion tech-driven logistics and transportation network. I picked up the stack of papers. Preston watched me with a smug, satisfied grin, fully expecting me to sign my life away out of blind familial loyalty. I flipped to the financial disclosure section of his contract. Because I managed massive corporate logistics, I knew exactly what a healthy balance sheet looked like. It only took me 10 seconds to spot the glaring discrepancies. He was inflating his inventory values and hiding massive liabilities under shell accounts. He was not expanding. He was drowning in debt and trying to use my clean company to absorb the hit when his dealership inevitably went under. Are you going to sign it or just stare at it all day? Warren demanded, his patience snapping. I pulled a pen from my purse. Warren slammed his fist down on the table, rattling the silverware. You sign this right now or you are dead to this family, he roared. I smiled. A slow, cold smile that made Preston shift uncomfortably in his seat. I uncapped my pen, but instead of signing my name on the dotted line, I flipped back to the asset declaration page. I drew a thick, dark circle around the fraudulent inventory valuations. Then I flipped to the liabilities page and circled the hidden offshore debts. I tossed the pen onto the contract and slid the entire stack back across the mahogany table, directly into Preston's chest. You cannot use fake inventory to secure a federal bridge loan. Preston, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. That is interstate bank fraud, and I do not attach my street hustle to federal crimes. I stood up, picking up my purse. I looked down at my father, whose face was frozen in shock. Consider me dead, Warren. It is safer that way. I turned and walked out the front door, leaving the smell of Sunday dinner and the stunned silence of my toxic family behind me. I knew they would not let this go easily. I knew they would retaliate. But they had absolutely no idea who they had just declared war on. The silence in my car as I drove away from my parents' house was the most peaceful thing I had experienced all week. I knew walking away from that dining table would have consequences. Preston was a man whose ego was as fragile as his over-leveraged balance sheet. He was used to bullying people into submission, especially women and especially his wife's family. He would not let a perceived slight from a high school dropout go unpunished. I fully expected him to retaliate. I just did not expect him to be so spectacularly stupid about it. I kept my small 2-bedroom apartment in South Atlanta for exactly this kind of situation. It was my camouflage. While my actual primary residence was a sprawling, secure penthouse in Buckhead, I maintained this modest lease to keep my family completely in the dark. It was sparsely furnished with standard retail store items, holding only a few changes of clothes and a decoy laptop. To Brenda, Warren, and Dominique, this was exactly the kind of place a struggling dispatcher deserved to live in. It confirmed their biases and kept them comfortably arrogant. Tuesday morning, my encrypted work phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The caller ID showed Marcus, the regional director of one of Omnifleet's smaller local transport subsidiaries. This was the exact subsidiary where my family believed I worked as a low-level hourly employee, taking phone calls and scheduling truck drivers. Marcus sounded completely bewildered when I answered. Madam CEO, I apologize for interrupting your morning, he said, his voice tight with confusion. But I just had the most bizarre phone call with one of our local clients, Preston Vance from the Vance Auto Group. I smiled, pouring myself a cup of black coffee. Tell me everything, Marcus. Marcus explained that Preston had called his direct line in an absolute rage. Preston had spent 20 minutes screaming at Marcus, demanding that a dispatcher named Keisha be terminated immediately for gross insubordination. Preston claimed I had disrespected him personally and threatened that if I was not fired before noon, he would pull all of his dealership's transport contracts from the subsidiary. He actually told me he would ruin our local branch if I did not put you on the street, Marcus said, sounding almost amused. He threw his weight around, claiming he was a major player in the Atlanta luxury car market. The irony was staggering. Preston thought he was flexing his muscles against a mid-level regional manager to get a minimum wage worker fired. He had no idea that the subsidiary he was threatening belonged to a massive corporate umbrella, and he certainly had no idea that the woman he was trying to fire owned the entire umbrella. Play along, I told Marcus, taking a sip of my coffee. Tell him you are horrified by my behavior. Tell him you have pulled my file and that I am officially terminated effective immediately. Let him feel like he won. Marcus chuckled. Consider it done, Madam CEO. I hung up the phone and waited. I knew my sister. Dominique would not be able to resist the opportunity to gloat. She thrived on seeing me fail because my failure was the only thing that justified her unearned success. Exactly 2 hours later, a sharp, demanding knock echoed through my apartment. I opened the door to find Dominique standing in the hallway, looking completely out of place against the peeling paint of the corridor. She was wearing a pristine, cream-colored Chanel trench coat, a flawless silk scarf, and holding a Birkin bag that cost more than my neighbor's cars. Her face was set in a mask of practiced pity, the exact same expression our mother used right before she delivered an insult. She did not wait for an invitation. Dominique pushed past me, stepping into the small living room and wrinkling her nose at the simple furniture. She looked around, taking in the cramped space with visible satisfaction. You really brought this on yourself, Keisha, she said, turning to face me. You always have to be so difficult. Preston was trying to help you on Sunday, and you embarrassed him in front of our parents. You know how stressful his business expansion is right now. I crossed my arms, leaning back against the kitchen counter. So you came all the way to South Atlanta to defend your husband's honor. Dominique sighed, shifting her expensive bag to her other arm. I came here because I am a good sister, and because we are a Christian family that does not abandon our own even when they act like fools. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a crisp, personal check. She tossed it onto the kitchen counter. It fluttered down, landing next to my coffee mug. $500. I looked at the check, then back at her. What is this? Consider it severance, Dominique said, her lips curling into a smug smile. Preston made the call this morning. He spoke directly to the regional manager at your dispatch office. You are officially unemployed, Keisha. The manager was very apologetic to Preston. He pulled your file and fired you on the spot. You should have thought about the consequences before you tried to play lawyer at the dinner table. I stared at her, letting the silence stretch. She was absolutely vibrating with triumph. She had come here to watch me break. She wanted me to cry, to beg, to apologize. She wanted me to feel the same helplessness I felt at 19 when they stole my college money. But we do not want to see you out on the street, Dominique continued, her tone dripping with fake charity. Preston is a generous man. If you bring the LLC paperwork to his office by Friday and sign it over completely, he is willing to give you a job. It is not in the office, obviously, since you proved you cannot handle business. But he needs someone to wash and detail the cars on the back lot. It pays minimum wage, but it is honest work for someone with your background. Plus, this $500 will keep your lights on until your first paycheck. I looked down at the check again. My name was written in Dominique's perfect cursive handwriting. The memo line read, Charity. The sheer suffocating arrogance of it was almost intoxicating. I reached out and picked up the small slip of paper, holding it gently between my fingers. I looked my sister dead in the eyes, maintaining complete emotional control. I did not raise my voice. I did not frown. I maintained the cool, calculated composure that had built a $2 billion empire. I placed my thumbs at the top of the check and tore it precisely down the middle. Dominique gasped, stepping back as if I had struck her. Her eyes widened in genuine shock. "What is wrong with you?" she snapped, her voice losing its fake sweetness. "I am trying to save you from starvation." I let the two halves of the check flutter to the floor, landing softly on the linoleum. "You misunderstood the situation, Dominique," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, deadly quiet register. "Preston did not get me fired this morning. He does not have that kind of power. He does not have any power at all." Dominique crossed her arms, her face twisting into an ugly sneer. "I was sitting right there when he made the call, Keisha. I heard him tell your manager to pack up your desk. Stop lying to save your pride. You have nothing." I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. "I was not fired, Dominique. I simply instructed the regional manager to terminate my company's transport contract with Preston's dealership. Your husband relies on our logistics fleet to move his imported luxury cars from the port to his showroom. As of this morning, he no longer has a carrier. You can keep your minimum wage and your $500. I suggest you hold on to that cash. You are going to need it very soon." Dominique stared at me for a long, heavy second. Then she threw her head back and burst into sharp, mocking laughter. The sound bounced off the cheap walls of the decoy apartment. She laughed so hard she had to wipe a tear from the corner of her eye. "You really are completely delusional," she said, shaking her head in pity. "Your company's transport contract. You answer phones, Keisha. You do not own anything. You are a high school dropout who cannot face the reality of her own miserable life. You are literally making up fantasies to cope with being a failure." She adjusted her silk scarf and pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Do not come crying to Mom and Dad when the eviction notice gets taped to this cheap door. We wash our hands of you." She spun around on her designer heels and marched out of the apartment, slamming the door so hard the framed picture on the wall rattled. I stood in the quiet kitchen, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading down the hallway. I walked over to the window, pulling the blinds back just a fraction. I watched Dominique climb into the driver's seat of her pristine white Mercedes SUV, a vehicle entirely funded by fraudulent loans and stolen inheritance. She backed out of the parking space and sped away, thinking she had just secured the ultimate victory over her loser sister. I let the blinds fall back into place. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my encrypted primary phone. I bypassed the standard contacts and dialed my chief operating officer directly. Trayvon answered on the first ring. "Madam CEO." "Trayvon," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "It is time to initiate a total supply chain blackout on Preston Vance and the entire Vance Auto Group. Make it effective immediately across all networks." "Understood," Trayvon replied, the sound of keyboard clacking echoing through the line. "To what extent do we black them out?" "Total and absolute," I commanded. "I want every single carrier driver, flatbed operator, and logistics partner in our entire continental network to refuse his loads. Flag his dealership in the central database as a critical risk. Cancel all pending deliveries. Reroute any of his inbound inventory currently in transit and drop it at the nearest impound holding facility." Trayvon paused for a fraction of a second, understanding the sheer gravity of that order. Omnifleet controlled nearly 70% of the luxury auto transport in the Southeast. Without us, Preston's business would paralyze overnight. "Consider it done," Keisha Trayvon said. "They will not be able to move a single set of wheels." "Thank you, Trayvon," I said. "Let us see exactly how many luxury cars the great Preston Vance can sell when my fleet refuses to move his inventory." I ended the call and looked down at the torn pieces of the $500 check on the floor. The game had officially started, and they had blindly walked right onto my board. Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock sharp, I sat at the head of the polished obsidian conference table in the Omnifleet executive boardroom. We occupied the entire top floor of our Buckhead headquarters, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass. that offered a commanding view of the Atlanta skyline. Trayvon, my chief operating officer, stood at the front of the room projecting the real-time logistics heat map for the southeastern United States onto the massive digital display. The screen was a sprawling sea of glowing green lines, representing our thousands of active transport routes moving millions of dollars in freight by the minute. But right in the center of the Atlanta metropolitan area sat a glaring dead zone, a dark static void on the map. That black void was the Vance Auto Group. 72 hours into the total supply chain blackout, Trayvon reported swiping his tablet to bring up Preston's dealership inventory metrics. The bleeding is severe and accelerating. He currently has 40 luxury imports sitting at the Savannah port. They are racking up thousands in daily commercial storage fees because absolutely no carrier will touch them. He also has 20 sold vehicles on his showroom lot that he cannot deliver to out-of-state buyers. His entire operation is completely gridlocked. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, savoring the crispness. Any workarounds, I asked. None. Trayvon smirked, adjusting his tailored suit jacket. He tried calling independent regional carriers first. But our proprietary algorithm essentially controls the regional freight boards. When we flagged his dealership as a critical non-payment risk, the independent drivers immediately blacklisted him too. No one wants to risk taking a load from a dealer who might not pay the invoice. Preston is effectively paralyzed. He cannot get new cars to sell, and he cannot deliver the cars people have already paid for. I looked back at the massive digital map tracing the glowing green routes that crisscrossed the city streets. My eyes settled on a specific intersection in downtown Atlanta, the corner of Peachtree and Ralph McGill. 16 years ago, that exact concrete corner was my entire world. It was the location of the damp, freezing bus bench I slept on after Brenda and Warren changed the locks on my childhood home. I had begged them to return the college money my grandmother had specifically left for me, but they refused. They chose to fund Dominique's luxury lifestyle and sorority image over my basic survival. While Dominique was driving her brand new BMW to college frat parties, I was riding the city bus at dawn to a windowless dispatch office in an industrial park. I spent my days answering ringing phones for a failing local transport company making barely above minimum wage. But I did not just answer phones. I paid attention. I watched the immense chaotic inefficiencies of the trucking supply chain. I saw trucks driving hundreds of empty miles, wasting fuel and time. I taught myself to code on a cracked second-hand laptop during my overnight shifts. I built a predictive algorithm that paired empty trucks with pending freight loads, completely eliminating deadhead routes. That little piece of code turned into a regional software platform. That platform attracted massive venture capital and eventually evolved into OmniFleet. I did not just buy a few transport trucks. I built a $2.5 billion tech-driven logistics network that now controlled the absolute lifeblood of commerce across 7 states. My family still thought I was a lowly dispatcher coordinating taxicabs. They could not fathom that I owned the very roads they drove their leased luxury cars on. Trayvon tapped his tablet, bringing up a new glowing red alert on the main presentation screen. Which brings us to Preston's latest desperate move, Trayvon said, his voice shifting back to a serious professional tone. Preston is officially panicking. His silent investors are starting to demand answers about why inventory is stalled and why revenue has flatlined this week. So he is attempting a massive bypass. If he cannot hire third-party transport carriers to move his cars, he wants to lease his own fleet of commercial transport trucks and handle the logistics internally. I raised an eyebrow, leaning back in my leather ergonomic chair. He does not have the liquid capital to buy commercial car haulers outright. Those rigs cost hundreds of thousands of dollars each. Exactly, Trayvon nodded, tapping the screen again. So he applied for a corporate commercial lease. He submitted an expedited application at 2 a.m. He is requesting 4 heavy-duty multi-car transport rigs to move his inventory himself. And where exactly did he apply? I asked, already knowing the beautiful irony of the answer. Trevon smiled a sharp, predatory grin as he tapped the screen to reveal the financial application header. Through the OmniFleet automated commercial leasing portal. He has absolutely no idea that OmniFleet Holdings is the parent company of the local logistics subsidiary he insulted on Monday. And he definitely has no idea that you are the chief executive officer. To him, we are just a massive, faceless corporate leasing bank with deep pockets. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold obsidian table. Show me the financials on the application. We both know his dealership balance sheets are a house of cards. How is a man drowning in offshore debt trying to secure a multi-million-dollar commercial truck lease? Trevon expanded the application document on the massive screen, highlighting the collateral section in bright yellow. He could not use the dealership assets, Trevon explained, tracing the text with a laser pointer. He already over-leveraged his business to the point of near insolvency. Our automated underwriting system would have rejected him in 10 seconds. So he brought in external guarantors to secure the lease. He submitted a joint collateral agreement to bypass the credit check. I read the names projected on the screen. My breath hitched for a fraction of a second. The guarantors listed on the commercial lease application were Warren and Brenda. Preston was not just risking his own failing business anymore. He had actively convinced my parents to back his desperate, highly risky play. I scanned the asset list they had submitted to the bank. They had pledged their entire joint retirement portfolio. Every single dollar they had saved over 40 years of working. Worse, they had put up the actual deed to their sprawling brick house in the suburbs, the exact same house I was kicked out of when I was 19. They had blindly mortgaged their entire future, their hard-earned safety net, their very home, just to prop up the golden child's husband. They believed in Preston's fake wealthy image so deeply, they were willing to bet their absolute survival on his business acumen. They handed over everything they owned to a man committing federal bank fraud. Trevon looked down at me, waiting for the executive directive. The financials are a complete house of cards, Keisha Trevon said quietly, the amusement gone from his voice. If we approve this massive lease and he defaults, we get the trucks back easily. But the contract also gives us the immediate legal right to liquidate the guarantor's collateral to cover the severe contract penalties. We would be in a position to seize their retirement funds and foreclose on their home. Do we reject the application to protect them? I sat in the quiet boardroom staring at the glowing names of the people who had drained my grandmother's inheritance, the people who had left me on the street to freeze. I thought about Warren calling me pathetic at the dinner table. I thought about Brenda telling me I was an embarrassment to the family because I did not wear designer clothes. I thought about the sheer arrogance of Dominique handing me a torn $500 check like I was a beggar. They had always chosen Dominique and Preston over me. They had always valued the illusion of wealth over actual family loyalty. "Approve it," I said, my voice echoing like ice in the large room. Trevon blinked, clearly surprised by the lack of hesitation. "Approve it. Approve it immediately," I repeated, standing up from the table and smoothing the front of my blazer. "But bypass the standard terms and activate the strict default clause. If he misses a single payment by even 1 hour, the contract goes into total default and we seize the collateral without a grace period. Give them the rope, Trevon. Let us see what they do with it." 2 days later, my phone rang with a summons disguised as an invitation. My mother Brenda requested my presence for lunch at the Oakmont Country Club. Oakmont was an ultra-exclusive, predominantly white establishment nestled in the affluent northern suburbs of Atlanta. For Brenda, securing a membership, there was the crowning achievement of her life. It was the ultimate stage for her to project her carefully curated image of the perfect, flawless black elite family. She used the sprawling manicured golf courses and crystal chandeliers the same way she used Dominique as a shiny prop to validate her own existence and mask her deep-seated insecurities. I knew exactly why she wanted me there. She needed an audience to force my hand. I arrived precisely on time, dressed in a simple, unbranded black turtleneck and tailored trousers. It was a deliberate choice. I preferred quiet luxury, selecting fabrics that spoke for themselves without screaming a designer's name. But in Brenda's world, If a logo was not plastered across your chest in gold hardware, you were destitute. I handed my keys to the valet and walked through the heavy mahogany doors, ignoring the questioning glances of the lobby staff, who were not used to seeing a young black woman walking in with such quiet, unbothered authority. I found her seated on the sprawling outdoor terrace, surrounded by three of her most judgmental, high-society church friends. They were a flock of women dripping in David Yurman pearls and oversized Chanel sunglasses sipping sparkling water as if they owned the very air they breathed. As I approached the table, the conversation abruptly halted. Brenda looked me up and down, her lips thinning into a tight, disappointed line. She did not stand to greet me. She simply sighed, a dramatic, breathy sound designed to draw the attention of the women beside her. "Keisha," she said, her tone laced with manufactured pity, "I am so glad you could take time out of your little dispatch schedule. But really, you could have put in a bit more effort. We have a certain standard to uphold here." Her friends chuckled softly, adjusting their designer bags on the pristine white tablecloth. Mrs. Higgins, a woman whose husband owned a chain of dry cleaners, offered a condescending smile. "It is fine, Brenda. Not everyone has the means to present themselves properly. We understand." I took my seat, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. I ordered a glass of water and let them talk. For the first 40 minutes, I endured a masterclass in passive-aggressive abuse. Brenda held court loudly, boasting about Dominique's fabulous life and Preston's supposedly booming auto empire. She made sure to emphasize how Preston was a real provider, a man of vision, while periodically casting sympathetic glances my way. She ordered the most expensive items on the menu: imported sea bass, caviar appetizers, truffle fries, and 3 bottles of vintage champagne for the table. It was a calculated psychological breakdown. She was setting the stage, priming me to feel small, worthless, and desperate for her approval. Then, right as the plates were cleared, she sprang the trap. Brenda folded her hands, resting them on the table, leaning in with a sharp predator's gaze. "Keisha, your sister called me this morning in tears," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that was still perfectly audible to her friends. "She told me how you acted at your apartment, tearing up a charity check from your own blood. You are letting your petty jealousy ruin your soul." I remained silent, watching the ice melt in my glass. I knew exactly what was happening at that very moment across the city. My supply chain blackout was in full effect. Preston's dealership was completely paralyzed, and his desperate lease application was currently sitting on Trayvon's desk, waiting to trigger a massive financial default on my parents' house. But Brenda, sitting here in her pearls, had absolutely no idea. Preston is facing a temporary cash flow issue because of his massive, highly successful expansion. Brenda continued, lying through her teeth without a flinch. "Since you stubbornly refuse to sign over your little LLC, the least you can do is take out a personal loan to help him float the week." I looked up, meeting her eyes. "You want me to take out a high-interest personal loan for Preston?" "Yes," Brenda snapped, her patience fraying. "It is what family does. We sacrifice for each other. You have no husband, no children, and no real assets. You have absolutely nothing to lose. Go to the bank, take out $50,000 and give it to Preston. He will pay you back when his expansion settles." The sheer delusion was staggering. She was demanding I go into personal debt to fund a man who was actively committing fraud, all while sitting at a country club she was paying for with money she did not actually have. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "Mom, Preston is not expanding. His dealership is suffocating. If he needs $50,000 that badly, he should sell one of Dominique's 3 luxury cars. Or better yet, he can use the commercial trucks he just leased by leveraging your retirement fund." Brenda's face hardened, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. She had no idea what I was talking about regarding the trucks, completely oblivious to the financial death warrant she and Warren had blindly co-signed just 24 hours earlier. "You are a selfish, bitter woman, Keisha," she spat, her voice rising enough to turn heads at the neighboring tables. "You will die alone in that pathetic little apartment because you do not know how to support the people who actually matter." Just then, the waiter approached in a crisp white uniform, carrying a black leather folder containing the bill. The total for 5 women indulging in a midday feast was astronomical. Brenda snatched the leather folder from the waiter's hand. She did not even look at the receipt. She simply slid it directly across the table until it hit my water glass. A cruel, triumphant smirk spread across her face. Her friends watched in breathless anticipation, ready to witness my complete humiliation. "You eat, you pay," Brenda announced, her voice ringing out crisp and clear over the ambient noise of the terrace. "Assuming your card does not decline. Stop embarrassing the family with your poverty and handle the check like an adult." I looked at the black leather folder. Then I looked at Brenda, whose eyes were dancing with malicious joy. She wanted to see me sweat. She wanted to see me pull out a battered debit card and pray there were enough funds to cover her extravagance. I did not break eye contact. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a heavy matte black solid titanium card. It was an ultra-exclusive invite-only Centurion card. The kind of card that did not have a spending limit. The kind of card issued only to individuals whose net worth required a team of wealth managers to calculate. I let it slip from my fingers. The heavy metal hit the table with a sharp, distinct clack that cut through the soft jazz playing overhead. Brenda stared at the black card, her brow furrowing in confusion. She opened her mouth to ask what kind of fake plastic I was trying to use, but the words never left her throat. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the general manager of the Oakmont Country Club sprinting across the terrace. This was a man who prided himself on invisible, slow-paced service, yet he was practically jogging toward our table, his face flushed, adjusting his tie in a sheer panic. He bypassed Brenda completely. He ignored her wealthy friends. He stopped directly behind my chair and bowed forward slightly, his posture radiating absolute deference. "Madam CEO, I am so incredibly sorry for the intrusion," he said, his voice trembling with eager respect. "The waiter did not recognize you immediately. Please accept my deepest apologies. Your corporate executive membership dues already cover all premium dining and private events at this establishment. This meal is entirely on the house." The silence that descended upon the sun-drenched terrace was absolute. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the clinking of silverware from distant tables and the gentle splashing of the courtyard fountain. Brenda sat frozen. Her mouth was slightly ajar, her hands suspended mid-air where she had just shoved the leather billing folder toward me. The heavy titanium Centurion card gleamed on the white tablecloth like a loaded weapon. The general manager, a man who usually operated with the quiet discretion of a ghost, stood rigidly at attention beside my chair. He did not look at Brenda. His eyes were fixed respectfully on me, waiting for my instruction. Mrs. Higgins and the other high society church friends exchanged frantic, wide-eyed glances. The synchronized sipping of sparkling water had stopped completely. They leaned back in their wrought iron chairs, their designer sunglasses failing to hide their absolute shock. They had spent the last hour treating me like a charity case, a tragic stain on Brenda's flawless family tapestry. Now the highest-ranking official at their exclusive club was bowing to me and addressing me with a corporate title they could not even begin to comprehend. "Madam CEO." Brenda finally choked out the words, scraping against her throat as if she were swallowing glass. "What on earth is he talking about? What did you do?" I did not answer her. I kept my gaze locked on the general manager, offering him a brief, appreciative nod. "Thank you, Charles," I said, my voice perfectly level. "That will be all for my tab. However, I believe my mother is still managing her own accounts today." Charles cleared his throat, shifting his posture slightly as he finally turned his attention to Brenda. His professional demeanor remained flawless, but the warmth vanished instantly, replaced by the strict administrative tone reserved for delinquent accounts. "Yes, Mrs. Vance," Charles said, pulling a small, discreet tablet from his jacket pocket. "Since I have you here, I must address an administrative matter regarding your family's account. I attempted to contact your son-in-law Preston this morning, but his primary lines appear to be disconnected." Brenda blinked rapidly, her perfectly powdered face draining of color. "Disconnected? That is impossible. Preston is in the middle of a major expansion. He is likely just switching telecom providers." Charles offered a tight, uncompromising smile. "Be that as it may, ma'am, I must inform you that Preston's quarterly membership dues check bounced at 0800 hours this morning. The bank flagged it for insufficient funds. Furthermore, the secondary account he listed under your name for overdraft protection also declined the charge. The collective gasp from the table of church friends was loud enough to startle a passing waiter. Mrs. Higgins actually dropped her linen napkin. In the world of the Oakmont Country Club, a bounced check was not just an administrative error. It was social suicide. It was the ultimate indicator that you did not belong. I need you to clear the outstanding balance of $12,000 before you leave the premises today. Mrs. Vance Charles continued, his voice carrying clearly over the crisp afternoon air. Otherwise, per club bylaws, we will be forced to suspend your access card and revoke your gate privileges immediately. I can process a wire transfer or a different credit card right now if you prefer. Brenda looked as if she had been physically struck. Her eyes darted wildly from Charles to the heavy titanium card sitting in front of me, and then to the horrified faces of her so-called friends. The pristine illusion she had spent decades building was shattering into a million jagged pieces right in front of the very women she used to validate her worth. She was no longer the matriarch of a booming luxury empire. She was a woman whose son-in-law was writing bad checks to cover her country club dues. "This is a mistake," Brenda stammered, her voice pitching upward into a frantic, shrill register. "My husband and I are fully funded. Preston is fully funded. There is a glitch in your system." "I assure you, ma'am, there is no glitch," Charles replied, his tone hardening just a fraction. The bank was quite clear. Insufficient funds across all linked accounts. Brenda suddenly slammed her hands down on the table, rattling the crystal water glasses. She turned her furious, desperate gaze entirely on me. "You did this!" she hissed, her face twisting into a mask of pure venom. "You set this up. I do not know what kind of cheap parlor trick you pulled with that metal card or who you paid off to call you a CEO, but you hacked the system. You manipulated Preston's accounts to embarrass me in front of my friends." The sheer level of delusion required to blame me for Preston's insolvency was staggering. She was so deeply entrenched in her own lies that she would rather believe I orchestrated a massive cyber attack on a country club than admit her golden son-in-law was a fraud. It reminded me of the day I found out they drained my college fund. She had blamed me then too, claiming I was too ungrateful to understand high-level financial investments. I looked at her friends. Mrs. Higgins was already edging her chair away from the table, creating physical distance from the impending scandal. They were sharks, and there was blood in the water. Brenda's social reign at Oakmont was officially over. "Mom," I said, keeping my tone completely devoid of emotion, "I do not hack bank accounts. I run supply chains. Preston's check bounced because his dealership has not moved a single vehicle in 3 days, and his creditors are finally calling in his debts. The money is gone. The facade is over." "You are a liar!" Brenda shrieked, pointing a trembling manicured finger at my face. "You are nothing but a jealous, bitter little girl who wants to destroy her sister's happiness. You are going to pay for this. I will make sure everyone knows exactly how toxic and disturbed you are." I reached out and picked up my heavy Centurion card, sliding it smoothly back into my blazer pocket. I stood up from the table, moving with deliberate, unhurried grace. I adjusted the lapels of my coat, looking down at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. "You can tell everyone whatever story helps you sleep at night, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, authoritative register. "But stories do not pay the country club dues. You should probably check your retirement accounts. If you tied them to Preston's commercial leases, you might not even have a house to go back to tonight." I did not wait for her response. I turned and walked away from the table, leaving Brenda hyperventilating amidst the judgmental stares of her high society circle and the unyielding demands of the general manager. The sound of her frantic excuses faded as I stepped through the mahogany doors and handed my ticket to the valet. I drove back to the Omnifleet headquarters feeling a profound sense of closure. The emotional hold my family had over me was officially dead. I walked into my executive suite and immediately noticed Trevon standing by my desk. His posture was rigid and he was holding a thick stack of legal documents. "We have a situation," Trevon said, skipping the usual greetings. "Preston has completely lost his mind." I tossed my keys onto the desk. What did he do? Traven dropped the documents right in front of me. After his corporate lease application defaulted this morning, he realized he was totally locked out of the logistics network. His dealership is effectively bankrupt, and his creditors are preparing to seize his lot. He panicked, but instead of filing for bankruptcy, he decided to go on the offensive. He just filed an emergency injunction and a civil lawsuit in Fulton County Court against your LLC. I frowned, picking up the legal filing. He is suing my company. He is not just suing it, Trevon said, his voice tight with disbelief. He is attempting a hostile legal takeover. He thinks you are just running a small independent dispatch operation out of that South Atlanta apartment. His lawsuit claims that because your parents raised you and supposedly funded your early education, they are legally entitled to a controlling stake in your business assets. He is acting as their designated financial proxy. He is trying to seize your company to liquidate your assets and save his dealership. I read through the absurd legal jargon. Preston was arguing that I was a rogue family member hoarding communal wealth. He was demanding a court order to freeze my business accounts and transfer operational control of my LLC directly to him to compensate for the emotional and financial distress I had allegedly caused the family. He actually thought he could bully a judge into handing over my business just because Warren and Brenda claimed they owned me. He thinks he is stealing a tiny dispatch office, I said, a slow laugh escaping my chest. He has no idea he just sued a $2.5 billion corporate entity, Trevon replied, shaking his head. Our legal department is already reviewing this. The claims are completely frivolous and legally baseless. They want to file an immediate motion for dismissal and hit him with sanctions. Do I give legal the green light to crush this? I stared at the lawsuit in my hands. Preston was desperate, cornered, and lashing out wildly. He wanted to take everything I had built and use it to patch the holes in his own sinking ship. He wanted to legally bind me to my toxic family forever. No, I said, looking up at Trevon with a sharp, calculated smile. Do not dismiss it. Let the lawsuit proceed. Trevon blinked. You want to entertain this madness. I want him in a sworn deposition, I replied, tossing the document back onto the desk. I want Preston, my father and my mother, sitting in a recorded legal proceeding, under oath, thinking they are about to seize my little dispatch hustle. Let them walk right into a federal courtroom. We are not just going to defend my company, Trevon. We are going to countersue for targeted corporate sabotage and defamation. They want my assets. I am going to let them try to take them. I walked into the towering glass and steel high-rise in downtown Atlanta exactly 48 hours later. Preston had demanded an emergency mediation settlement meeting through his newly hired legal counsel. His formal summons had been dripping with aggressive legal threats, insisting I present myself at his executive corporate suite to resolve the hostile receivership he had filed against my company. He wanted me on his turf. He wanted home field advantage. I obliged him simply because I wanted to look him in the eye when the floor finally caved in. The receptionist at the Vance Auto Group executive suite guided me through a set of heavy frosted glass doors and into a sprawling corner office. The space was a masterclass in manufactured prestige. It featured rented modern art, imported leather sofas, and a massive mahogany desk that looked like it had been staged for a magazine shoot rather than actual work. Preston was standing behind the desk, leaning forward on his knuckles in an aggressive power pose. Dominique sat on one of the leather sofa's legs, elegantly crossed, wearing a tailored crimson pantsuit. She looked like the reigning queen of a kingdom built entirely on sand. Next to her sat a man in a cheap but flashy pinstripe suit who reeked of cheap cologne and predatory desperation. This was clearly the sleazy corporate lawyer they had scraped from the bottom of a billboard advertisement. "Have a seat, Keisha," Preston commanded, pointing a stiff finger at the single uncomfortable wooden chair positioned directly across from his massive desk. I did not sit. I remained standing near the center of the room, resting my hands lightly on the sides of my leather briefcase. "I prefer to stand, Preston. Tell me why you wasted my afternoon." The lawyer stood up immediately, eager to justify his retainer fee. He slapped a massive 4-inch thick binder onto the mahogany table with a loud theatrical thud. My name is Sterling, and I represent the financial interests of the Vance family, and by extension your parents, Warren and Brenda. We are here to discuss the immediate transfer of your limited liability company into a family-managed trust. I looked at the giant binder, then at the lawyer. A family-managed trust. Exactly. Dominique chimed in, her voice echoing with that familiar, suffocating arrogance. You have been running wild, Keisha, refusing to help family, causing a scene at Mom's country club, and acting like you are some kind of boss. Preston is a seasoned businessman. He knows how to handle corporate assets. We are taking over your little operation before you run it straight into the ground. Preston walked around the desk, puffing out his chest. He stopped a few feet away from me, looking down his nose. The game is over, Keisha. I filed a hostile receivership motion in Fulton County Court this morning. That binder contains over 500 pages of legal filings, injunctions, and financial audits. My legal team is prepared to tie you up in litigation for the next 10 years. We will freeze your personal bank accounts. We will subpoena your dispatch logs. We will completely destroy your little street hustle until you are begging for bankruptcy. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a threatening growl. The legal premise is simple. Your parents provided the foundational support that allowed you to survive. They raised you. They clothed you. Therefore, the family possesses a legal communal equity stake in whatever assets you have scraped together. You owe them. And by extension, you owe me. Sterling tapped the massive binder. If you fight this, we will bury you in court fees. You will not be able to afford the legal representation required to combat a firm of our size. However, my client is generous. If you sign the asset transfer documents today, relinquishing total control of your LLC to Preston, he will drop the lawsuit and even grant you a modest weekly stipend. Preston picked up a heavy gold-plated pen from his desk and slid it across the mahogany surface. It stopped right at the edge of the desk, pointing directly at my chest. Sign the papers, Keisha. Give up the street hustle and let the adults handle the business. I looked down at the gold pen resting on the dark wood. The sight of it, the sheer oppressive atmosphere of 3 people trying to legally bully me into submission, triggered a visceral, heavy memory. The edges of Preston's flashy office seemed to blur, dissolving into the stuffy beige interior of a local bank manager's office 16 years ago. I was 19 years old. I was wearing a faded thrift store jacket, sitting in a cracked vinyl chair. Warren and Brenda were flanking me, standing exactly like Preston and Dominique were standing now. The bank manager had slid a stack of legal documents across a cheap laminate desk. The papers were designed to completely legally transfer my grandmother's educational trust fund and my newly awarded federal college grants directly into Brenda and Warren's primary joint account. My mother had smiled a tight, fake smile at the bank manager, claiming it was for safekeeping. But when the manager briefly stepped out of the room, the mask dropped. I had hesitated, staring at the pen, my hand shaking. I knew if I signed that paper, my future was gone. I knew they were going to use my tuition money to buy Dominique a graduation car. Warren had leaned down, gripping my shoulder so hard his fingernails dug into my collarbone. You sign that paper right now, he had whispered, his breath hot against my ear. We raised you. We fed you. You owe us every single cent of this money. If you do not sign it, I will throw all your belongings onto the front lawn and you can sleep on the street. I had been terrified. I had been a vulnerable, uneducated teenager who believed her parents had all the power in the world. I picked up the pen and signed my name. 4 days later, they bought Dominique her BMW. A week after that, when I demanded enough money to at least cover a community college textbook, Warren followed through on his threat. He threw my bags out the front door and locked the deadbolt. I slept on the concrete bench at the Peachtree bus stop that very night, wrapping my thrift store jacket around my shoulders to keep from freezing. I blinked, pulling myself out of the memory. The damp cold of that Atlanta night faded, replaced by the climate-controlled air of Preston's executive suite. I looked at Preston. I looked at Dominique. I looked at the sleazy lawyer who thought he was dealing with a frightened minimum wage dispatcher. The parallel was striking. The tactic was exactly the same. They wanted to use intimidation, legal threats, and familial guilt to rob me blind. But the power dynamic had completely fundamentally inverted. I was no longer a terrified 19-year-old girl sitting in a cheap vinyl chair. I was a woman who could buy and sell everyone in this room before my morning coffee got cold. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not even reach for the gold-plated pen. Instead, I slowly unclasped the brushed steel latch of my leather briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out a heavy matte black dossier. It was embossed with the silver Omnifleet corporate seal. I dropped it onto the mahogany desk. It hit the wood with a dense, heavy thud that completely dwarfed the sound of their fabricated legal binder. Preston stared at the black dossier, his arrogant sneer faltering for a fraction of a second. "What is this?" he demanded. "You filed a hostile receivership lawsuit to seize my company's assets," I said, my voice perfectly calm and deadly quiet. "You claimed you are going to freeze my dispatch logs and take over my street hustle, but you clearly did not read the corporate registration for the LLC you are suing." Sterling, the lawyer, frowned, stepping forward to look at the silver seal on the dossier. His eyes widened slightly. "My little LLC is a holding subsidiary." I continued, holding Preston's gaze. "It is the parent entity for Omnifleet Holdings. You just filed a frivolous lawsuit attempting a hostile takeover of a $2.5 billion international logistics and transportation network." Dominique scoffed, crossing her arms tightly. "You are lying. You coordinate truck drivers. You do not own a billion-dollar company. Stop trying to bluff your way out of this, Keisha." I ignored her, keeping my eyes locked entirely on Preston. The color was slowly draining from his face as his brain tried to process the name Omnifleet. He knew that name. Every luxury auto dealer in the Southeast knew that name. It was the exact company he had blindly applied to for a commercial lease 2 days ago. "You are suing Omnifleet Holdings." "Preston," I asked, tilting my head slightly, "you want to freeze my assets and take my property? I suggest you open that dossier and flip to page 4. You might want to read who owns the ground you are standing on." Preston stared at the heavy black folder sitting on his desk as if it were a live explosive. His hand hovered over it, his fingers twitching slightly. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered across his face just moments before had completely vanished, leaving behind a rigid mask of uncertainty. He did not want to open it. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him that the contents of that dossier would destroy the fragile reality he had constructed. But the silence in the room was deafening, and my gaze was unyielding. He slowly reached out and flipped open the matte black cover. The crisp white pages inside were branded with the silver Omnifleet watermark and stamped with the unmistakable official raised seal of the Fulton County Clerk. Preston stared at the first page. The color drained from his face at an alarming rate, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His eyes darted back and forth across the dense legal paragraphs, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his hands now visibly shaking. "What is it?" Dominique demanded, her voice tight with sudden anxiety. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward on the imported leather sofa. "Preston, what does it say? Tell her to get out of your office." Preston did not answer. He could not answer. He was completely paralyzed. Sterling, the sleazy corporate lawyer, pushed his cheap pinstripe suit jacket back and practically lunged over the mahogany desk. He snatched the dossier from Preston's trembling hands and began to read. As a man who made his living filing frivolous lawsuits and bullying small businesses, Sterling knew how to read a room. But more importantly, he knew how to read a certified legal deed. I watched as the realization hit him. The predatory confidence evaporated from Sterling's posture like water on a hot skillet. He pulled a crumpled handkerchief from his pocket and began dabbing furiously at his forehead. He flipped to page 4, just as I had instructed. His eyes widened to the size of saucers, and he let out a low, sharp breath. "This is a certified transfer of deed," Sterling whispered, his voice cracking. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with absolute terror. He realized he was not dealing with a vulnerable 19-year-old girl. He was sitting in a room with a corporate titan, and he had just threatened her with a hostile takeover. This is a fully executed commercial real estate acquisition. What are you talking about? Dominique shrieked, standing up from the sofa. Her perfectly curated composure was shattering. She marched over to the desk and snatched the dossier from the lawyer. She stared at the pages, but the complex corporate terminology clearly meant nothing to her. It is fake, she declared, tossing the folder back onto the desk with a dismissive wave. Keisha printed this out at home. She is trying to scare us. Preston, call security and have her removed from your building. It is not a fake document, Dominique. I said, my voice perfectly level, cutting through her hysteria like a blade. It is a recorded deed of trust, finalized and filed with the City of Atlanta. Omnifleet does not just handle logistics and supply chain management. We have a highly aggressive commercial real estate division. We specialize in acquiring premium commercial properties that are mismanaged by their current ownership groups. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the mahogany desk, closing the distance between us. 3 days ago, I continued keeping my eyes locked on Preston Omnifleet real estate acquisitions, purchased the debt, and the absolute ownership rights to this entire high-rise building. We bought it outright from the previous management group in a silent, all-cash transaction. You do not own this shiny executive suite, Preston. You never did. You lease it. And as of 3 days ago, you lease it from me. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He gripped the edge of the mahogany desk so hard his knuckles turned white. His eyes darted wildly around the lavish office, taking in the rented modern art, the imported leather sofas, and the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Atlanta. The space he had used to project his dominance and fake wealth was now a gilded cage, and I held the only key. Sterling took a large step back away from Preston and Dominique. Madam CEO, he stammered, his voice shaking with a pathetic, desperate reverence. I want to formally state for the record that my firm was entirely unaware of the corporate structure of Omnifleet Holdings. We were retained under the false pretense that we were dealing with a minor independent LLC. We completely and immediately withdraw the hostile receivership motion. We withdraw all claims. You cannot do that, Dominique screamed, whirling around to face the lawyer. We paid you a retainer. You work for us. You have to take her company. I strongly advise you to stop talking. Mrs. Vance Sterling shot back, his self-preservation instincts overriding any loyalty to his clients. He frantically shoved his massive binder of fabricated legal threats into his battered briefcase. You do not understand what is happening here. You just tried to launch a hostile takeover against a $2 billion corporate entity. They will not just sanction me. They will have me disbarred and bankrupt by Friday. Sterling snapped his briefcase shut and practically ran toward the frosted glass doors. I apologize for the intrusion, Madam CEO, he called over his shoulder before bolting out of the executive suite and abandoning Preston entirely. The heavy glass doors clicked shut, leaving the three of us alone in the sprawling office. Preston finally found his voice. His tone was hollow, stripped of all the arrogance and entitlement he had worn for years. You bought the building, he whispered, staring at the silver Omnifleet seal on the dossier. You bought the entire high-rise just to get to me. I did not buy it just to get to you, Preston, I replied smoothly. I bought it because it is a highly profitable commercial asset. But having you sitting in my property pretending to be a self-made mogul is certainly an added benefit. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper. I placed it directly on top of the black dossier. Let us talk about your street hustle, I said, tapping the paper. That is a printed copy of the rent ledger for this specific executive suite. When my team audited the building's accounts after the acquisition, we discovered some very interesting discrepancies. You lease this corner office for $18,000 a month to project an illusion of success to your investors. But according to this ledger, you have not made a single payment in 2 months. Dominique gasped, stepping back as if the piece of paper had physically burned her. Preston, what is she talking about? You told me the business was booming. You just bought me a new diamond tennis bracelet last week. He bought you a bracelet with the money he was supposed to use to pay his commercial rent, I clarified, not breaking eye contact with Preston. He has been moving capital around to maintain your lavish lifestyle while his actual business suffocates. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of the mahogany desk. You wanted to play corporate warfare, Preston. You wanted to threaten me with legal action and tell me my hustle was over. Well, here is the reality. You are officially my tenant, and according to this ledger, you are 60 days late on rent. I am initiating immediate eviction proceedings. You have exactly 48 hours to clear out this office before my security team comes up here and throws your rented furniture onto the sidewalk. Preston staggered backward, falling heavily into his expensive ergonomic office chair. The devastating reality of his situation crashed down on him. If he lost this executive suite, his remaining investors would instantly know he was completely insolvent. The illusion would shatter. His creditors would descend like vultures, and his auto empire would be publicly liquidated. He was entirely cornered. He had stepped right into a bear trap, and I was holding the chain. Just then, the silence in the room was shattered by the sharp ringing of Preston's cell phone resting on the desk. The caller ID flashed brightly. It was Brenda. Preston stared at the phone, his chest heaving with panic. He did not want to answer it, but Dominique desperately lunged forward and hit the speakerphone button, needing someone, anyone, to save them from this nightmare. Preston. Thank God, Brenda's voice echoed through the office, frantic and breathless. The background noise sounded like she was pacing rapidly across her hardwood floors. Everything is a disaster. The general manager at Oakmont just humiliated me in front of the entire committee. He said your checks bounced. He threatened to revoke my gate privileges. Tell me this is just a bank error. Tell me you have the funds. Mom. Preston is bankrupt. Dominique cried out, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob. Keisha bought his office building. She is evicting him. He does not have any money left. There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the gears turning in Brenda's head as she realized her entire world was collapsing. Her pristine image, her country club status, her golden child's fake empire, it was all burning to the ground simultaneously. But Brenda Vance was not a woman who accepted defeat. She was a woman who doubled down on delusion. Listen to me, Brenda suddenly announced, her voice hardening with a manic, desperate authority. We are not losing everything today. We just need a massive injection of emergency capital. We need private investors to bail out the dealership and cover the accounts before the banks freeze everything. How are we going to get private investors? Dominique demanded, wiping a tear from her cheek. Everyone in the city is going to know we are broke by the end of the week. Not if we control the narrative, Brenda fired back, her tone rising with frantic, absolute determination. Rich people only give money to other rich people. We have to project an illusion of massive, untouchable wealth. Warren and I are going to announce a lavish high society charity gala. We will book the grand ballroom at the St. Regis. We will invite every major investor, venture capitalist, and socialite in Atlanta. We will throw the most extravagant party this city has ever seen. Preston looked at the speakerphone, his eyes wide with disbelief. Brenda, we do not have the money to book the St. Regis. We do not have the money to pay for the catering. I will leverage the house, Brenda snapped, completely losing her grip on reality. I will take out a second mortgage. I will max out the emergency credit lines. It does not matter what it costs up front. When those investors see us hosting $1 million charity gala, they will believe your auto empire is thriving. They will write checks to back your expansion, and we will use those funds to pay off the debts. It is flawless. I stood in the center of the executive suite, listening to the sheer staggering magnitude of their delusion. They were literally planning to borrow against their own home to throw a fake charity party in a desperate bid to trick investors into saving them. They were digging their own graves, and they were too blinded by their obsession with status to realize it. I looked at Preston, who was slowly nodding, as if this insane plan was actually going to work. I picked up my briefcase, turned my back on the burning wreckage of their lives, and walked out the door. The days following my exit from Preston's rented executive suite were a masterclass in watching a sinking ship pretend to be a luxury cruise liner. Brenda and Warren did not scale back. They doubled down. My mother leveraged every remaining ounce of equity in her home, tapping into predatory high-interest loans just to fund the illusion. The St. Regis Grand Ballroom was booked. A desperate PR campaign was launched targeting every wealthy investor and high society church member in Atlanta. Preston was marketing the gala as a celebration of the Vance Auto Group's unprecedented quarterly expansion. It was a spectacular house of cards built on fumes and fraud. 48 hours before the event, my phone buzzed with a text message from Brenda. It was not an apology. It was an imperial decree. The catering company is understaffed for the gala on Saturday. I told the event coordinator you would arrive at 4 p.m. sharp to assist in the kitchen. Use the service elevator in the loading dock. Do not embarrass us by mingling with the actual guests. Wear black. She was drowning in debt moments away from total financial ruin, and her priority was still making sure I knew my place. She wanted me carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres while she paraded around in rented diamonds. She needed me in a subservient role to validate her own fragile superiority. It was the exact same tactic she used when I was 15 years old. She had forced me to wear a maid's apron and serve drinks at her neighborhood association party because she was ashamed of my thrift store clothes. She had whispered in the kitchen that serving others was the only way I would ever be allowed in a room full of successful people. I replied to her text with a simple acknowledgement. I will be there. Saturday evening descended on Buckhead with a crisp, expensive chill. The St. Regis was completely swarming with local media-hired paparazzi and Atlanta's financial elite. Brenda had spared absolutely no expense to craft her mirage. As my driver pulled up to the outer perimeter of the hotel, I watched the spectacle unfold. A private helicopter with the Vance Auto Group logo, temporarily decaled on the side, was ferrying VIP guests from a nearby airstrip directly to the venue. The deafening chop of the rotor blades echoed off the surrounding glass high-rises. Below, a pristine fleet of Rolls-Royces and extended wheelbase Maybachs lined the red carpet, depositing women draped in couture and men in bespoke tuxedos. It was a sickening display of borrowed wealth, a massive theatrical production designed entirely to trick venture capitalists into opening their checkbooks. I did not direct my driver to the loading dock. I had the car pulled directly up to the edge of the velvet ropes. I stepped out into the blinding flash of camera bulbs. I was not wearing black catering attire. I was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue Tom Ford suit. The cut was razor-sharp, radiating an effortless, commanding authority that completely eclipsed the rented glamour surrounding me. A heavy silk blouse rested beneath the blazer, and a vintage Cartier watch gleamed at my wrist. I walked past the velvet ropes, completely ignoring the bewildered looks of the valets and the event staff who were holding clipboards, trying to verify names. I strode through the massive glass double doors of the St. Regis, owning the ground I walked on. The grand lobby was a sea of glittering gowns and tuxedoed investors holding champagne flutes. I could hear Preston's booming voice echoing from the grand staircase, loudly boasting to a group of executives about his fictional multi-state supply chain acquisition. He was playing the part of the triumphant tycoon while legally facing eviction from a building I owned. Brenda was standing beside him, smiling graciously for a photographer, projecting the image of a flawless, wealthy matriarch. I bypassed the crowded coat check and walked directly toward the secluded VIP elevator bank. Trayvon was already there, waiting in the shadows of a massive marble pillar. He was wearing a sharp charcoal suit, his eyes locked onto an encrypted tablet in his hands. He looked up as I approached, a predatory gleam flashing in his eyes. He did not ask why I was not in the kitchen. He knew exactly why we were really here. "You look like a woman ready to tear down a building," Trayvon said, tapping the screen of his iPad. "I hope you are ready, because the financial audits on this party just came back, and Preston's desperation has officially crossed the line into felony territory." I stopped beside him, folding my arms. What did he do now? Trayvon turned the iPad toward me. The screen displayed a real-time GPS tracking grid showing dozens of blinking blue dots clustered around the St. Regis. "You see that fleet of Maybachs and Rolls-Royces parading outside. You see the private helicopter ferrying the VIPs. Preston wanted to look like a billionaire to secure emergency capital tonight. But he could not afford the deposit on the luxury rentals. So he went through a third-party exotic leasing agency and paid the massive upfront rental fees using a series of corporate checks. I stared at the blinking blue dots, perfectly aligned along the red carpet outside. Do not tell me he bounced the checks for the cars, too. He absolutely bounced them, Trayvon said, a slow, ruthless smile spreading across his face. The bank rejected them an hour ago, but that is not the best part. That third-party exotic leasing agency Preston used, he did not bother to check their corporate umbrella. They are a direct subsidiary of Omnifleet Holdings. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. Preston was parading around Atlanta throwing a fake billionaire charity gala using a fleet of multi-million-dollar vehicles that legally belonged to my corporate network. He was stealing from me to impress the very people he hoped would save him from me. He had rented the very illusion he was standing on from the woman he was trying to destroy. Madame CEO Trayvon said, his voice dropping to a low, highly anticipated whisper. Preston is currently in illegal possession of $7 million worth of Omnifleet commercial property. The vehicles are technically stolen. We have the right to secure our assets immediately. Give me the word. I looked past Trayvon toward the grand staircase where Preston was currently posing for a photo with a prominent venture capitalist, his fake smile plastered across his face. Brenda was standing next to him, draped in pearls, soaking in the admiration of her church friends. Dominique was hovering nearby, wearing a gown that likely cost more than the catering budget. They thought they had won. They thought the illusion was secure. They believed they were untouchable. I turned back to Trayvon, meeting his eyes with absolute freezing clarity. Repossess them, I commanded, my voice slicing through the ambient noise of the lobby. Every single car, the helicopter, everything. Do not wait until the party is over. Do it right now. I want heavy-duty tow trucks and corporate repo teams pulling those Maybachs away right in the middle of the red carpet. Let the investors watch the fake empire get towed away. The Astor Ballroom of the St. Regis was a breathtaking monument to financial desperation. Brenda had transformed the massive space into a glittering wonderland of crystal chandeliers, cascading white orchids, and imported silk draping. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided gracefully across the polished marble floors, carrying heavy silver trays of beluga caviar and vintage Dom Perignon. The room was absolutely packed to capacity with Atlanta's financial elite. I recognized hedge fund managers, venture capitalists, and the city's most prominent real estate developers mingling near the open bars. Brenda and Warren were working the room with the practiced ease of seasoned con artists. My mother was holding a crystal flute of champagne, throwing her head back in manufactured laughter as she charmed a table of high society church members. She looked radiant, completely consumed by her own toxic delusion. Dominique was holding court near a towering ice sculpture dripping in heavy diamond necklaces and matching chandelier earrings. She kept deliberately touching her collarbone, ensuring the rented stones caught the light and blinded anyone standing within a 5-foot radius. I stood quietly near the back of the ballroom, nursing a glass of sparkling water. Watching them operate felt like watching a highly rehearsed stage play. It was the exact same performance Brenda used to put on when I was a teenager. I vividly remembered the Christmas I was 16. Brenda had maxed out 3 different credit cards to buy an absurdly large imported pine tree and cater a neighborhood holiday dinner. 10 minutes before the guests arrived, the electricity was shut off because she had not paid the utility bill in 3 months. She had lit dozens of expensive candles and told the neighbors it was a Victorian-themed evening. She had shoved me into the dark kitchen and aggressively ordered me to keep my mouth shut about the power company, warning me that if I ruined her image, I would regret it. Tonight was no different. It was just the $10 million version of the Victorian candle lie. The low murmur of wealthy networking abruptly halted as the grand ballroom doors swung shut and a bright spotlight hit the center stage. Preston strode up the steps, exuding a sickening level of arrogance. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo jacket and tapped the microphone. The high-pitched feedback echoed over the state-of-the-art sound system, instantly capturing the attention of every billionaire and socialite in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Preston began, his voice booming with fake humility, "I want to personally thank each and every one of you for attending the Vance Auto Group inaugural charity gala. When I look out at this magnificent room, I do not just see investors, I see partners. I see visionaries who understand that the future of luxury transportation belongs to those who are bold enough to seize it." He paused, letting the polite applause roll over him. He was eating it up, completely drunk on his own fabricated power. "As many of you know, the Vance Auto Group has experienced unprecedented exponential growth this quarter." Preston continued, lying through his teeth with a terrifying ease. "Our regional expansion is fully funded and aggressively moving forward. We are dominating the luxury auto market. We are untouchable. And that level of massive success is precisely why we believe in giving back to the community tonight. Because when you operate at the absolute pinnacle of your industry, you have a moral obligation to share the wealth." He gestured grandly toward Brenda and Dominique, who were standing in the front row, glowing under the stage lights. "And I could not have built this empire without the foundational support of my brilliant mother-in-law, Brenda, and my stunning wife, Dominique. They are the true architects of this family's legacy." The crowd erupted into louder applause. The venture capitalists in the front row were nodding in approval, holding their champagne glasses and buying into every single word. Preston was actually pulling it off. He was successfully projecting the illusion of a thriving, untouchable auto empire. He was moments away from securing the emergency capital he needed to pay off his fraudulent debts and save his dealership from total liquidation. I remained rooted to my spot at the back of the ballroom, my expression perfectly neutral. I slowly turned my head toward the massive glass double doors that separated the ballroom from the grand lobby. Through the thick, polished glass, I could see Trayvon. He was standing completely still in the VIP entrance, holding his encrypted tablet in his left hand and his phone in his right. His eyes were locked on me, cutting through the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. I took a slow sip of my water. I lowered the glass. And then I gave him a single sharp nod. It was the green light, the absolute point of no return. Trayvon did not hesitate. He lifted his phone to his ear, spoke a single command, and immediately turned on his heel, walking swiftly out the front doors of the hotel. Preston was still holding the microphone, launching into a detailed, entirely fictional breakdown of his future corporate acquisitions. But his words were suddenly swallowed by a deep, unnatural vibration. It started as a low, rhythmic rumble that reverberated through the marble floors of the ballroom. Then came the unmistakable, throaty roar of heavy-duty diesel engines. It was not just one engine, it was a massive mechanical chorus. The investors in the back rows stopped listening to Preston and turned their heads toward the grand entrance. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows framing the St. Regis lobby, blinding flashes of amber and red strobe lights began bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. The synchronized flashing illuminated the elegant ballroom in a chaotic, violent glow. "What is going on out there?" a prominent hedge fund manager muttered, setting his champagne flute down on a passing silver tray. The polite silence of the gala shattered. The wealthy guests began murmuring in confusion, pointing toward the windows. Preston faltered on stage. His booming, confident voice cracked mid-sentence. He tapped the microphone again, staring out at the disrupted crowd, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen," he stammered, a heavy bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. "It seems we have a minor commotion outside. Please direct your attention back to the stage." But nobody was looking at the stage. The entire room was shifting toward the glass doors to witness the spectacle unfolding in the driveway. I walked slowly behind the crowd, watching the scene unfold with absolute, unyielding satisfaction. Outside, the pristine valet circle was being completely overrun. A dozen massive, heavy-duty commercial tow trucks were rolling aggressively past the velvet ropes. Their massive steel grills and oversized tires completely dominated the elegant driveway. Emblazoned on the side of every single truck in reflective silver lettering was the OmniFleet corporate logo. They did not stop at the curb. The drivers navigated the massive machines directly onto the red carpet, completely crushing the extravagant floral arrangements lining the walkway. The pneumatic brakes hissed loudly, a sound that pierced the elegant atmosphere of Buckhead like a gunshot. The doors of the tow truck swung open simultaneously. A small army of repossession agents stepped out wearing black tactical gear and heavy work boots. They carried thick steel chains, hydraulic winches, and heavy clipboards. They completely ignored the screaming valets and the horrified black tie guests spilling out of the hotel lobby. They marched directly toward the fleet of extended wheelbase Maybachs and pristine Rolls-Royces that Preston had parked out front to project his fake wealth. The lead agent, a massive man with a clipboard, walked right up to the $1 million private helicopter idling on the adjacent helipad. He ignored the protesting pilot and slapped a bright yellow grounded repossession sticker directly onto the cockpit glass. The clanking of heavy steel chains echoed through the night air as the tow truck drivers systematically dropped to the ground and began hooking up the axles of the luxury vehicles. Inside the ballroom, Preston finally realized what was happening. He looked through the glass windows and saw the Omni Fleet logos flashing under the amber strobe lights. The color instantly vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost trapped under the stage lights. The absolute terror in his eyes was blinding. He dropped the microphone. It hit the hardwood stage with an ear-piercing electronic squeal that made the investors cover their ears in pain. Brenda let out a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream as she watched a tow truck physically lift the front wheels of the flagship Maybach off the red carpet. Preston did not even bother to use the stairs. He jumped directly off the front of the stage, shoving past a billionaire venture capitalist, and sprinted wildly through the grand ballroom. He burst through the glass double doors, practically tearing them off their hinges, and charged out onto the red carpet. "Stop!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. "Put the cars down! What are you doing? I am calling the police. You cannot take these. I am calling the police right now." He was flailing his arms, screaming at the indifferent tow truck drivers, making a massive, humiliating public spectacle in front of the exact investors he needed to survive. Preston slammed his palms against the massive chrome grille of the lead tow truck, desperately trying to physically halt 3 tons of idling machinery. The deep vibration of the diesel engine rattled right through the soles of his patent leather shoes, but he refused to move. He was completely unhinged, shouting frantic legal threats that were instantly swallowed by the mechanical whine of hydraulic winches. To his immediate left, a team of repo agents in black tactical gear were already lifting the rear axle of a pristine white Rolls-Royce off the crushed floral arrangements of the red carpet. The heavy steel chains clanked loudly against the metal undercarriage, sounding like the absolute end of his fictional empire. Behind Preston, the heavy glass double doors of the St. Regis swung wide open. The gala attendees were pouring out onto the marble steps, drawn by the chaotic symphony of sirens and shouting. The hedge fund managers, the venture capitalists, the old money socialites, and the prominent church members all stood shoulder to shoulder. They held their crystal champagne flutes and their expensive designer clutches, watching the spectacle with morbid, horrified fascination. The sweeping amber and red strobe lights from the dozen tow trucks washed over the crowd, illuminating their shocked faces in a violent, rhythmic pulse. The elegant, sophisticated atmosphere Brenda had drained her last dime to create was entirely obliterated, replaced by the gritty reality of a commercial repossession. Preston realized his entire audience was watching. The exact people he needed to bail out his failing auto group were standing on the stairs witnessing his public execution. He tried to pivot, puffing out his chest, and attempting to project the false authority he had relied on his entire life. He pointed a shaking finger at the lead dispatcher, a massive man wearing a high-visibility Omni-Fleet jacket who had just stepped down from the cab of the primary truck. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "I am a billionaire. I own this entire fleet. You are trespassing on a private high society event. I will buy your pathetic little towing company by tomorrow morning, and I will personally fire every single one of you. Unhook those vehicles right now, or I am having you arrested for grand theft." The lead dispatcher did not flinch. He did not look intimidated. He simply looked annoyed. He unclipped a heavy stack of laminated paperwork from his metal clipboard and took a deliberate step toward Preston. He did not lower his voice. In fact, he raised it, projecting with the practiced volume of a man used to giving orders over loud machinery, making absolutely certain that the wealthy crowd standing on the steps heard every single syllable he spoke. "We are not a local towing company, sir," the dispatcher announced, his voice echoing across the valet circle. "We are the Asset Recovery Division of Omnifleet Holdings, and we are not stealing anything. We are executing a corporate repossession order. You do not own these vehicles. You leased them through our exotic subsidiary division using fraudulent accounts." Preston's face went chalk white. He opened his mouth to deny it, to spin another lie to the investors watching him, but the dispatcher did not give him a single second to breathe. "We have direct orders from the CEO of Omnifleet." The dispatcher continued, holding up the stack of legal documents like a weapon. "These vehicles are being immediately repossessed for severe contract fraud and the deliberate issuance of bounced checks. You paid the rental deposit with funds that do not exist. You are currently in illegal possession of $7 million worth of commercial corporate property. Step away from the truck, sir, before I have my security team physically remove you for interfering with a lawful asset recovery." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of socialites and investors standing on the steps. The whispers began instantly spreading like wildfire through the ranks of the elite. The venture capitalist, who had been shaking Preston's hand just 5 minutes earlier, turned to his associate, shaking his head in absolute disgust before walking back inside the hotel. The illusion was completely shattered. Everyone in that wealthy crowd instantly realized that Preston Vance was not a self-made titan. He was a desperate fraud who could not even afford the cars parked outside his own party. Brenda pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her meticulously styled hair falling flat in the humid night air. Her face was flushed a dark, patchy red, and her breathing was shallow and erratic. Dominique trailed closely behind her, clutching her rented diamond necklace with both hands, as if she was terrified the repo agents were going to rip it right off her throat. Brenda frantically surveyed the total devastation of the red carpet. She watched the private helicopter get branded with a bright yellow grounded sticker. She watched the Maybach get hoisted into the air. Her eyes darted wildly around the valet circle, desperately searching for a scapegoat, a savior, or a miracle. Then her gaze landed on me. I was standing near the edge of the red carpet, perfectly positioned in the shadows to watch the entire collapse unfold. The amber strobe lights caught the sleek midnight blue fabric of my custom Tom Ford suit, but Brenda was entirely too panicked to notice the expensive cut of my clothes or the vintage Cartier watch gleaming on my wrist. She only saw the daughter she had always treated like a burden. She only saw the target of her lifelong disdain. Brenda lunged forward, her high heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. She closed the distance between us and clamped her manicured fingers tightly around my forearm. Her grip was desperate, her nails digging sharply into the premium wool of my jacket. "Keisha!" she screamed, her voice shrill and trembling with sheer panic. "Do you see what is happening right now? Do you see what they are doing to us? These tow trucks have your company's logo on them. They are ruining the gala. They are destroying everything we built." I looked down at her hand, clutching my arm. I did not move a muscle. I simply stared at her, waiting for the inevitable demand. "You work for these people," Brenda ordered, shaking my arm as if trying to physically rattle me into action. "You coordinate the drivers. I know you have contacts in the dispatch office. You need to call your boss right now. Tell them it is a huge mistake. Beg them for a favor. Tell them we will pay whatever they want next week, but they have to put the cars down tonight. Use your little dispatcher contacts to stop this before Preston's investors leave. Do something useful for this family for once in your life." Dominique rushed up beside our mother, her eyes wide and pleading. "Keisha, please," Dominique begged, her arrogant superiority completely dissolved into pathetic desperation. "If those investors leave, Preston is going to lose the dealership. The banks are going to take my house. Just call your manager. Tell them to give us one more day." I stood perfectly still, the chaotic roar of the diesel engines and the hydraulic winches swirling around us. I looked at Brenda's flushed, panicked face. I looked at Dominique's trembling hands. I looked at Preston, who was currently being shoved away from a tow truck by a massive security agent. They were completely stripped of their fake prestige, begging the woman they had relentlessly humiliated to save them from their own fraudulent choices. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the raw power surging through my veins. I smoothly and deliberately pulled my arm out of Brenda's desperate grasp. I adjusted the cuff of my blazer, brushing off the spot where her fingers had just dug into the fabric. I raised my crystal glass and took a slow, methodical sip of my sparkling water, savoring the ice-cold clarity of the moment. The flashing amber lights illuminated my face as I looked directly into my mother's terrified eyes. "I cannot stop them, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly level, cutting through the noise of the idling trucks with deadly precision. The CEO gave a direct order to impound the fleet. The words hung in the crisp night air, sharp and unyielding. I watched as my mother's brain tried and completely failed to process the magnitude of what I had just said. Her eyes darted from the Omnifleet logos emblazoned on the sides of the tow trucks back to my face. Her jaw moved, but no sound came out. The perfectly constructed facade of Brenda Vance, the undisputed queen of Atlanta's high society, was cracking into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my eyes. She looked at the custom cut of my midnight blue suit. She looked at the vintage Cartier watch gleaming on my wrist. Then she looked back at the repo agents methodically dragging her son-in-law's fake wealth onto the beds of their heavy-duty trucks. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the chest. She staggered backward, her hand flying to her mouth. She bumped into Warren, who had just pushed his way through the stunned crowd of socialites and venture capitalists. Warren grabbed Brenda by the shoulders to steady her. He glared at me, his face contorting with a mixture of confusion and absolute fury. "What did you just say to your mother?" he barked, his voice laced with the same condescending authority he had used to throw me out of his house 16 years ago. "Stop playing games, Keisha. Call your boss right now and fix this mess before Preston loses his funding." "I do not have a boss, Warren," I replied, my voice echoing with icy absolute certainty. "I own Omnifleet Holdings. I am the CEO. I am the billionaire you are desperately trying to impress tonight. And I am the one who authorized the repossession of these stolen vehicles." The entire red carpet went completely dead silent. The grinding of the hydraulic winches and the low rumble of the diesel engines were the only sounds left in the world. The gala guests, the absolute elite of Atlanta's financial sector, heard every single word. Billionaires and venture capitalists do not become wealthy by ignoring red flags. They survive by knowing exactly when to abandon a sinking ship. The prominent hedge fund manager standing near the glass doors slowly lowered his champagne flute and handed it to a frozen waiter. He pulled out his phone, tapped a few buttons, and turned his back on Preston entirely. Within seconds, a massive synchronized exodus began. The illusion was dead, and the financial contagion was spreading. The elite socialites who had just been praising Brenda's philanthropic spirit began demanding their coats from the panicked valet staff. The private equity investors who had been nodding along to Preston's grand speech just 10 minutes earlier were now power-walking down the driveway, furiously barking orders into their cell phones to cancel any pending transactions associated with the Vance Auto Group. Preston was running frantically across the crushed floral arrangements of the red carpet, practically throwing himself in front of the departing investors. "Wait, please," he begged, grabbing the sleeve of a banking executive. "This is just a misunderstanding. The dealership is thriving. The quarterly reports are rock solid. Just come back inside and let me explain the expansion strategy." The banking executive ripped his arm out of Preston's grasp with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Do not ever contact my firm again," the executive snapped, brushing off his jacket. "You are completely insolvent, Vance. You paid for a charity gala with bounced checks and rented cars. You are a fraud." Dominique was standing frozen near the entrance of the St. Regis, watching her entire universe collapse in real time. She was clutching her rented diamond necklace, her mouth hanging open as the high society friends she had spent years desperately trying to impress walked right past her without a single glance. She was instantly radioactive. No one wanted to be associated with a family of broke, desperate con artists. Warren watched the wealthy elite flee the property. He watched his golden son-in-law practically sobbing on the pavement. The sheer magnitude of the humiliation finally caused something inside Warren to snap completely. He could not accept the reality standing right in front of him. His ego absolutely refused to process the fact that the daughter he had deemed worthless was the architect of his destruction. He marched aggressively toward me, closing the distance until he was inches from my face. His chest heaved and his face turned a dangerous shade of dark purple. "You are lying!" Warren roared, his voice echoing violently over the noise of the idling tow trucks. "You are nothing but a vindictive little liar. You do not own a billion-dollar company. You are a dispatcher. You coordinate truck drivers for a living. You, a billionaire. You didn't even finish college. You're nothing." He was pointing a shaking finger directly at my face, spitting the words with decades of pent-up venom. "You scraped together some pathetic little street hustle and you think you can stand here and humiliate this family. You think you can destroy your sister's life because you are jealous of her success. I know exactly who you are, Keisha. You are a failure. You have always been a failure. You do not have the brains or the pedigree to run a corporate empire. You are playing a stupid game, and I am going to make sure you pay for ruining this night." I stood my ground. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the man who had thrown my belongings onto the front lawn and forced me to sleep on a concrete bench in the freezing cold. He was practically foaming at the mouth, entirely consumed by his own delusional superiority. "You are right about one thing, Warren," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper that forced him to stop screaming and listen. "I did not finish college, because you forced me to sign away my educational trust fund so you could buy Dominique a luxury car. You threw me onto the street with absolutely nothing, but you severely underestimated what I could build with nothing." Warren opened his mouth to scream another insult, but the sound was abruptly and violently swallowed by a deafening mechanical roar. The noise did not come from the tow trucks, it came from above. The sky above the St. Regis seemed to tear open as the thunderous, rhythmic chopping of heavy rotor blades descended upon the venue. The remaining guests on the red carpet covered their ears and ducked as a massive hurricane-force wind swept across the driveway. Brenda shrieked and grabbed Warren's arm as her meticulously styled hair was whipped into a frenzy. Dominique stumbled backwards, struggling to stay upright in her expensive heels as the sheer force of the downdraft flattened the remaining floral arrangements and sent the velvet ropes crashing to the pavement. A massive, sleek, black corporate helicopter descended out of the night sky. It was easily twice the size of the rented chopper Preston had paraded earlier. The gleaming black exterior was entirely unmarked, except for a subtle brushed steel Omni-Fleet insignia on the tail. It hovered for a fraction of a second before touching down directly onto the venue's pristine manicured front lawn, bypassing the helipad entirely. The sheer aggressive dominance of the landing completely silenced Warren. He stared at the massive machine, his mouth hanging open in dumbfounded shock. Before the rotor blades even had a chance to slow down, the side doors of the helicopter slid open. A team of 6 men wearing dark tailored suits and earpieces stepped out, moving with practiced military precision. They fanned out across the lawn, forming a strict protective perimeter between the helicopter and the stunned crowd of onlookers. Then a final figure stepped out of the chopper. It was Trevin. He had vanished from the hotel lobby during the initial chaos of the repossession, and now I knew exactly where he had gone. He strode confidently across the lawn, the wind from the slowing rotors whipping his charcoal suit jacket. He walked straight past the line of Omni-Fleet security agents. He walked straight past Brenda, who was shaking in terror. He walked straight past Dominique, who was staring at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. And he walked straight past Preston, who was kneeling on the pavement, watching his rented Maybach get towed away. Trevon did not acknowledge a single one of them. He stopped directly in front of me. In his left hand, he held a heavy, locked titanium briefcase. The brushed metal gleamed under the flashing amber lights of the tow trucks. He held it out, presenting it to me with absolute professional reverence. Madame CEO Trevon said, his voice carrying perfectly over the dying whine of the helicopter engine. The aggressive acquisition of Preston's auto group is complete. We bought his debt for pennies. You now own everything he has. Preston's legs simply gave out. The structural integrity of his entire existence evaporated in a single second. He collapsed to his knees on the ruined red carpet, hitting the pavement with a dull thud. The amber and red strobe lights from the idling tow trucks washed over him, casting long, distorted shadows across the driveway of the St. Regis. He did not brace his fall. He did not attempt to stand back up. He simply knelt there amid the crushed white orchids and ripped velvet ropes completely shattered. His bespoke tuxedo jacket was covered in dirt from the tires, but he did not care. His mouth hung open, letting out ragged, shallow breaths as he stared blankly at the polished black shoes of the Omni-Fleet security agents, forming an impenetrable wall around me. Dominique began to hyperventilate. The perfect posture she had cultivated for years folded inward. She gripped the sides of her head, her manicured fingers tangling in her elaborately styled hair. Her rented chandelier earrings swung wildly, slapping against her neck as she gasped for air. She looked down at her husband kneeling in the dirt and let out a high-pitched, completely unhinged shriek. "Get up!" she screamed, kicking Preston's shoulder with the pointed toe of her designer heel. "Get up right now. Tell her it is a lie. Tell her you have offshore accounts. Tell her you are going to sue her." Preston, say something. Preston did not even blink. He remained frozen, staring into the void. He knew exactly how corporate debt acquisition worked. He knew that when an entity like Omnifleet bought his insolvent debt, they did not just buy his business. They bought his commercial leases, his inventory, his equipment, and every single piece of collateral tied to his name. I had not just closed his dealership, I had legally possessed his entire financial footprint. Warren was standing frozen near the shattered glass doors of the hotel lobby. The deep purple flush of rage that had colored his face just moments ago rapidly drained away, leaving his skin the color of old ash. His hands began to shake violently. He looked at Trayvon standing stoically beside me, holding the titanium briefcase. Then he looked at the fleet of repo trucks actively dragging the Maybachs onto flatbeds. The sheer, terrifying reality of corporate asset seizure finally penetrated his stubborn skull. Warren took a staggering step forward. His polished veneer was gone, replaced by the frantic, stumbling gait of a man walking to the gallows. He pushed past a lingering security guard, his eyes completely wild. "You bought his debt!" Warren choked out, his voice barely a rasp. "You bought the Vance Auto Group commercial loans from the regional bank." "Every single one of them," I replied smoothly, shifting the weight of the titanium briefcase in my hand. Omnifleet absorbed his toxic portfolio for literally pennies on the dollar. Preston was so deeply leveraged that the bank was thrilled to offload the liability. "I own the notes, Warren. Every single contract, every single promissory note, and every single piece of collateral used to secure those loans now legally belongs to my holding company." Warren let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. He gripped the lapels of his tuxedo jacket as if trying to hold his chest together. He turned to look at Brenda, who was staring blankly at the repossession agents. "If you take his company," Warren stammered, his voice rising to a frantic, terrified shout. "If you call in those loans, you are not just destroying Preston, you take our retirement. We co-signed all his business loans with the house." The words ripped through the cold night air like a shockwave. Dominique stopped hyperventilating long enough to stare at her father in absolute horror. "You did what?" she gasped. "We leveraged the estate," Warren shouted, pointing frantically at his kneeling son-in-law. "He told us he just needed a bridge loan to secure the new supply chain. He swore the quarterly profits would cover the margin. We put up the house. We put up the retirement accounts. We signed the deed as primary collateral to secure his credit lines." Warren turned back to me, his eyes wide with an animalistic terror. "Keisha, you cannot call in those loans. If you demand immediate payment, the bank will foreclose on the estate. You will be foreclosing on your own parents. You will make us homeless." I looked at the man who had physically thrown me out of his house when I was a teenager, holding my educational trust fund ransom so he could buy his favorite daughter a BMW. The man who had sneered at me and told me I was a failure just 10 minutes ago was now publicly begging me not to render him homeless. The irony was so potent, it practically tasted like vintage wine. "I am not making you homeless, Warren," I replied, my tone entirely conversational. "You made a high-risk financial investment in a fraudulent enterprise. Omnifleet is simply executing the legal right to seize the collateral attached to a defaulted asset. It is standard corporate procedure. It is strictly business." Brenda finally snapped out of her paralyzed trance. The realization that she was about to lose her country club mansion, her social standing, and her entire upper-class identity triggered a complete psychological override. The arrogant, condescending matriarch who had ordered me to use the service elevator an hour ago vanished entirely. In her place emerged a desperate, weeping manipulator ready to play whatever role necessary to save her own skin. She shoved her way past Warren and practically sprinted across the ruined red carpet. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup and leaving dark streaks of mascara across her cheeks. She held her arms out wide, aiming straight for me. "Keisha, my sweet girl." Brenda sobbed, her voice cracking with manufactured anguish. She lunged forward, trying to wrap her arms around my shoulders, trying to pull me into a motherly embrace that she had denied me for 16 years. I took a sharp, immediate step back. Trevon instantly moved shoulder to shoulder with me, physically blocking Brenda from making contact. She collided with his solid frame and stumbled back, clutching her hands to her chest. "Please," Brenda wailed, dropping to her knees right next to Preston in the dirt. "We are a family. We are your flesh and blood. You cannot do this to us. I know we have had our misunderstandings, but deep down we love you. We have always loved you. Blood is thicker than water, Keisha. You cannot put your own mother out on the street." She clasped her hands together, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "The Lord teaches us to forgive," she cried out loudly, projecting her voice so the remaining onlookers could hear her pious performance. "Blessed are the merciful. You have to find it in your heart to forgive us. We are your family. We are supposed to protect each other. I am your mother. You owe me a chance to make this right." I stared down at Brenda, kneeling in the debris of her shattered gala, weeping and quoting scripture to manipulate her way out of bankruptcy. She had not changed. She would never change. She only cared about family loyalty when it benefited her bank account. I did not raise my voice. I did not show anger. I simply placed the titanium briefcase on the hood of a nearby Omnifleet security vehicle. I keyed in the biometric code and unlatched the heavy metal clasps. The briefcase sprang open. Traven handed me a pair of white archival gloves, which I calmly slipped onto my hands. I reached into the protective casing and pulled out a stack of paper. The edges of the documents were yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded from spending over a decade locked in a secure bank vault. I held the stack of papers up so Brenda and Warren could see the official bank letterhead from 16 years ago. "You want to talk about blood, Mom?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly freezing whisper. "You want to talk about family protection and forgiveness? These are the original bank statements and the signed transfer documents from my grandmother's educational trust fund, the one you and Warren forced me to sign over to you when I was 19 years old. The money you stole from your own blood to buy Dominique a graduation present." Brenda's sobbing abruptly stopped. Her mouth clamped shut and the color completely drained from her tear-stained face. Warren took a step back, his eyes locked on the yellowed papers, trembling as the ghosts of his past sins resurrected right in front of him. "You threw me onto the street with nothing, so you could fund your favorite daughter's lifestyle," I continued, holding the papers steady in the cold wind. "You demanded I pay you back for the food I ate as a child. You told me I owed you. Well, today I am collecting my return on investment. I am not destroying your family. I am simply balancing the ledger." I held the stack of bank statements high in the air, making absolutely certain the papers caught the harsh amber glare of the strobe lights. The remaining gala guests, the ones who had lingered out of morbid curiosity, leaned in closer. The official bank letterhead from over a decade ago was undeniable. Brenda stared at the yellowed pages, and the remaining color drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and hollow. The pious religious facade she had just attempted to hide behind completely dissolved. "You drained my college fund," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the ruined red carpet. "You forged my signature and liquidated the exact account Grandma specifically left for me. Every single dollar she saved to ensure I had a future you stole. And you did it to buy Dominique a luxury car for her college graduation. You bought her a brand new convertible with the money that was supposed to pay for my education." Warren opened his mouth to formulate a defense, but the words died in his throat. The undeniable physical proof was right in front of him. "When I confronted you both about it, you did not apologize." I continued, the memories fueling the cold fire in my chest. "You told me I was ungrateful. You told me I owed you for raising me. And then, Warren, you packed my belongings in garbage bags and physically threw me out the front door. You let me sleep on a bus bench in the freezing rain when I was 19 years old. I spent 3 nights shivering under a broken transit shelter with absolutely nothing while my sister drove around in a German sports car paid for with my stolen future." Brenda let out a pathetic whimpering sound, burying her face in her hands. Warren stared at the pavement, his shoulders slumped, his entire authoritative presence completely eviscerated. "You begged me for mercy just now," I said, stepping closer to my parents, forcing them to look at the titanium briefcase filled with their financial ruin. "You told me we are a family. You told me we are supposed to protect each other. But you did not protect your blood then. Why should I protect yours now?" The silence that followed was absolute. The sheer weight of the betrayal laid bare for the entire world to see suffocated any remaining sympathy. But the silence was violently shattered by a sudden ear-piercing scream. Dominique completely lost her mind. The psychological shock of losing her wealth, her status, and her fictional superiority all in the span of 20 minutes completely broke her. She realized that she was no longer the wealthy elite wife of a successful auto magnate. She was the broke, disgraced sister of the billionaire she had spent her entire life tormenting. "You did this!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. Dominique lunged at me. She threw herself across the crushed floral arrangements, her manicured hands extended like claws, aiming directly for my face. She did not care about the onlookers. She did not care about her rented designer gown. She was entirely consumed by a feral, desperate need to physically harm the person who had stripped away her illusion. "You ruined my perfect life," she screamed, spittle flying from her lips as she thrashed forward. "You ruined everything." She never even made it within 5 feet of me. My security team reacted with terrifying efficiency. Trayvon did not even blink. He simply stepped forward and raised a single arm, intercepting Dominique mid-lunge. 2 massive Omni-Fleet security agents flanked him instantly, grabbing Dominique by the shoulders and easily subduing her. She thrashed wildly against their iron grips, kicking her legs and twisting her torso, but the highly trained agents held her perfectly still. One of the straps on her rented gown snapped. Her heavy diamond chandelier earrings swung violently against her neck, leaving angry red scratches across her skin. "Let me go!" Dominique shrieked, kicking her expensive heel against the shin of a security guard who did not even flinch. "I will kill you, Keisha. You are nothing but a jealous, worthless mistake. You ruined my life." I stood perfectly still, watching my older sister thrash against the security team like a captured animal. I did not feel anger. I did not feel fear. I felt a profound, ice-cold pity. I walked slowly toward her, stopping just out of her reach. I looked down at her ruined dress, her smeared makeup, and the wild, desperate panic completely consuming her eyes. "I did not ruin your life, Dominique," I said, my voice low and utterly void of emotion. "Your husband's incompetence and your own greed did that. Preston ran this auto group into the ground by leveraging non-existent assets to fund your extravagant lifestyle. You demanded mansions, you demanded private helicopters, and you demanded country club memberships. Preston committed massive corporate fraud just to keep you happy. You built a kingdom on a foundation of lies and bounced checks." Dominique shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect complexion. "No," she sobbed, her voice losing its aggressive edge and descending into a pathetic whimper. "We were successful. We were rich. You took it from us." "You were never rich," I corrected her, my words slicing through the night air like a scalpel. "You were deeply, profoundly in debt. You lived on stolen money and fraudulent credit lines. You drained our parents' retirement accounts and forced them to put a second mortgage on their estate just so you could throw a charity gala to impress people who do not even care about you. Omnifleet simply acquired the toxic debt that you and your husband created. I did not ruin anything, Dominique. All I did was stop paying the bill." Dominique sagged against the security guards, the last ounce of fight leaving her body. Her knees buckled, and the agents had to physically support her weight to keep her from collapsing into the dirt next to her husband. Preston was still kneeling on the pavement, entirely unresponsive, completely paralyzed by the reality of his financial execution. He was staring blankly at the spot where his flagship Maybach had been parked just moments before. Warren stepped forward, his hands raised in a final pathetic gesture of surrender. "Keisha, please," he begged, his voice trembling with a terrifying vulnerability. "Take the auto group. Take the dealership. Just release the lien on the house. Your mother and I have nowhere else to go. We are too old to start over. Please just let us keep the house." I looked at Warren, the man who had always demanded absolute perfection and punished anything less with ruthless cruelty. He was broken, stripped of his pride, and begging for scraps from the daughter he had thrown away. "You should have thought about your retirement before you co-signed a fraudulent corporate loan," I replied, turning my back on him. "The bank executes the foreclosure process automatically. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. I suggest you start packing tonight." I gestured to Trayvon, indicating that we were finished. The asset recovery was complete, the Vance Auto Group was officially liquidated, and my family's toxic reign was permanently dismantled. Trayvon nodded and motioned for the security team to release Dominique. She dropped to the pavement, curling into a tight ball next to Preston, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. I turned to walk back toward the waiting helicopter, the heavy downdraft of the idling rotors whipping my coat. I was ready to leave the wreckage behind me and return to the empire I had built. But the night was not over. Before I could reach the steps of the helicopter, a new sound cut through the ambient noise of the idling tow trucks. It started as a distant wail, rapidly multiplying and growing louder by the second. The remaining guests on the red carpet turned their heads toward the main entrance of the St. Regis property. The flashing amber lights of my Omnifleet tow trucks were suddenly overwhelmed by a blinding sea of flashing red and blue. A fleet of police cruisers came tearing up the curved driveway, their sirens blaring at deafening volumes. They did not stop at the valet stand. They swerved aggressively onto the property, forming a tight barricade that completely blocked the main exit. The heavy tires screeched against the pavement as the cruisers slammed into park. But it was not just local Atlanta police. Behind the marked squad cars, 3 black unmarked tactical SUVs pulled up. The doors flew open simultaneously. Men and women wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow letters across the back stepped out, moving with aggressive, coordinated purpose. FBI, Secret Service, federal authorities. They moved swiftly past the crushed floral arrangements and the fleeing socialites, heading straight for the center of the valet circle. The lead federal agent, a tall man with a stern face and a heavy tactical belt, unclipped a radio from his shoulder and signaled his team to secure the perimeter. Preston finally snapped out of his catatonic trance. He looked up at the flashing red and blue lights washing over the hotel facade. The sheer terror in his eyes magnified 1,000 times. He tried to scramble backward, scrambling away from the approaching agents like a cornered rat. Preston Vance, the lead federal agent, shouted, his voice booming with unquestionable authority. "Do not move another inch. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and the interstate transportation of stolen assets." The remaining crowd gasped, stepping back to give the federal agents a wide berth. The realization hit the red carpet like a bomb. Preston had not just lied to his local investors. He had not just bounced checks to his vendors. In his desperate, frantic attempt to keep Dominique draped in diamonds and his auto group afloat, Preston had illegally wired fraudulent funds across state lines to secure his exotic car fleet. He had falsified federal bank loans. He had crossed the line from a failing local businessman to a federal criminal. Two federal agents grabbed Preston by the arms, violently hauling him to his feet. They slammed him against the side of a marked cruiser, forcing his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed over the silent crowd. Dominique screamed, lunging toward her husband, but a female FBI agent immediately blocked her path, holding up a stern hand. "Ma'am, back away right now, or you will be detained for interfering with a federal arrest." Warren and Brenda stood frozen in absolute terror, watching their golden son-in-law getting read his Miranda rights. The ultimate climax of their greed was unfolding under the flashing police lights. They had sacrificed their daughter, their home, and their entire retirement to back a man who was now facing decades in federal prison. The heavy metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around Preston's wrists echoed like a gunshot across the ruined driveway. Two federal agents shoved him roughly against the side of the marked cruiser, pressing his cheek into the cold, damp metal. His bespoke velvet tuxedo jacket was bunched up around his shoulders, entirely ruined and stripped of its manufactured dignity. He twisted his neck frantically, trying to negotiate with the stone-faced agents, babbling incoherent promises about wire transfers and offshore accounts. The agents ignored him completely efficiently, patting him down, before forcing his head down and shoving him into the back seat of the federal vehicle. The remaining crowd watched in absolute stunned silence. The prominent church congregation members, who had praised Preston's philanthropy just an hour ago, were now actively backing away, covering their mouths in horror. The country club elite, the venture capitalists, and the buckhead socialites whispered furiously to one another, their eyes wide with morbid fascination. Preston Vance, the golden boy of Atlanta's luxury auto market, was locked in the back of a police car facing decades in federal prison for wire fraud. Dominique was left completely untethered. She collapsed onto the curb, her legs simply giving out beneath her. The relentless downpour from earlier in the week had softened the ground near the manicured lawn, and her red-bottomed designer heels sank deep into the wet, cold mud. The hem of her rented silk evening gown soaked up the dirty water, turning the fabric heavy and dark. She did not even attempt to stand. She just sat there in the filth, hyperventilating as she watched the flashing red and blue lights paint the St. Regis facade. Her perfect curated life was gone. The sprawling estate, the luxury vehicles, the private club memberships, and the untouchable social status had all been an illusion built on a foundation of federal crimes and stolen money. Dominique reached out a trembling hand toward a group of women she had called her best friends. They were wealthy socialites she had spent years carefully cultivating. Instead of rushing to comfort her, the women exchanged disgusted glances, turned their backs, and briskly walked toward the valet stand to retrieve their coats. Dominique was officially a pariah. She was radioactive. The wailing sound that erupted from her throat was a primal, raw expression of total defeat. A few feet away, the reality of the situation was actively crushing Brenda and Warren. With Preston's entire operation seized by Omnifleet and his imminent federal indictment hanging in the air, the financial dominoes were falling with ruthless speed. Brenda looked at the yellowed bank statements still resting on the hood of the Omnifleet security vehicle. The undeniable proof of their theft was out in the open. The church members and country club friends had heard every single word of my revelation. They knew that Brenda and Warren had stolen their own daughter's educational trust fund to buy a sports car. They knew they had let their 19-year-old child sleep on a freezing bus bench. The polished, righteous image they had projected for decades was completely obliterated. They were exposed as cruel, selfish thieves who had sacrificed one child to fund the fraudulent lifestyle of another. But the social execution was nothing compared to the financial ruin. Warren's eyes were wide and bloodshot, his chest heaving as he stared at the federal agents. He had co-signed Preston's commercial loans. He had leveraged the family mansion and drained their retirement accounts to secure the credit lines that Preston had used to commit federal bank fraud. With Omnifleet calling in the debt, Warren and Brenda were going to lose absolutely everything. The banks would foreclose on the estate within the month. Their savings were gone. Their credit was destroyed. They were staring down the barrel of total, immediate poverty in their old age. Warren took a slow, shaky step toward me. The arrogant, condescending patriarch who had dictated the terms of my existence for my entire childhood was entirely gone. He looked small, fragile, and desperate. He crossed the damp pavement, stopping just outside the perimeter of my security team. His hands were clasped together in front of his chest, trembling violently. "Keisha, please!" Warren begged, his voice cracking, completely void of its usual booming authority. "Please listen to me. I know we failed you. I know we made terrible, unforgivable choices. But you have billions of dollars. You own this entire corporate empire. You could wave your hand and clear that specific debt. You would not even feel the loss. Just clear the lien on the house. Please. We are old. We have absolutely nothing left. Just a fraction of your wealth would save us. You cannot let your own parents be thrown onto the street." Brenda scrambled to her feet, abandoning her sobbing golden child on the curb. She rushed to Warren's side, clutching his arm for support. Her makeup was entirely washed away by her tears, revealing the deep lines of age and stress she spent hours trying to hide. "She is right. Warren is right," Brenda pleaded, her voice thick and wet. "We were foolish. We were blind. We got caught up in the image and we forgot what really mattered. But we can change Keisha. We will do whatever you want. We will publicly apologize. We will make it right. Please just show us a little bit of mercy. Do not take the house. Do not leave us with nothing." I stood perfectly still, the cold wind whipping the edge of my coat. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world. I looked at the mother who had called me a mistake, and the father who had treated me like a servant. I searched my own heart, expecting to feel a surge of vindictive triumph or a flare of righteous anger. But I felt absolutely nothing. The burning rage that had fueled me for 16 years, the desperate need to prove them wrong, had completely evaporated. In its place was an overwhelming, pristine sense of closure. The emotional ledger was finally balanced. I was entirely free. I looked Warren directly in the eyes. My voice was calm, steady, and dangerously quiet. "I am not taking your house." "Warren," I said, the words hanging in the air with heavy finality. "You gave your house away. You gambled your retirement on a fraud and you lost. I am simply a businesswoman collecting a corporate debt. You chose your favorite daughter. You chose her husband. And now you get to live with the exact consequences of those choices." I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults. I simply turned my back on them, closing the book on their existence forever. I walked toward the massive black helicopter resting on the manicured lawn. Trayvon fell into step beside me, carrying the locked titanium briefcase containing the deeds to my new acquisitions. The powerful turbine engine of the chopper began to whine, pitching upward into a deafening roar as the heavy rotor blades spun to life. The downdraft flattened the grass and sent loose debris scattering across the driveway. I reached the steps of the helicopter and paused, placing my hand on the handrail. I turned my head and looked back at the valet circle one last time. The scene playing out under the flashing police lights was a masterpiece of poetic justice. The fragile alliance of the Vance family had completely shattered. Without my money to save them, they were instantly turning on each other like cornered animals. Brenda was screaming at Warren, hitting his chest with her fists, blaming him for signing the loan documents. Warren was shouting back, pointing angrily at Dominique. Dominique had crawled up to the window of the police cruiser, slapping her muddy hands against the glass, and screaming hysterically at Preston, who refused to even look at her. They were a pit of vipers finally consuming themselves. I turned away from the wreckage and stepped into the plush leather interior of the corporate chopper. Trayvon slid the heavy door shut, sealing us inside the soundproof cabin. I sank into the captain's chair, letting out a long, slow exhale. The tension I had carried in my shoulders for more than a decade vanished entirely. I reached beside my seat and picked up a pair of heavy-duty noise-canceling aviation headsets, sliding them comfortably over my ears. The screaming, the sirens, and the chaos of my past were instantly silenced, replaced by the smooth, steady hum of the communications channel. Clear for takeoff, Trevon said, speaking directly into his microphone from the seat opposite mine. The pilot nodded and manipulated the controls. The massive helicopter lifted smoothly off the lawn, leaving the St. Regis and the ruined remnants of my toxic family far below. We banked sharply, ascending into the dark night sky. I looked out the reinforced window, watching the sprawling, glittering skyline of Atlanta spread out beneath me. The towering skyscrapers and the endless ribbons of highway were illuminated in a sea of gold and white lights. The city looked beautiful. It looked like territory conquered and claimed. I settled back into the premium leather seat, crossing my legs and staring out at the empire I had built from absolutely nothing. The ultimate lesson here is that your worth is never defined by those who fail to see it. When toxic family members constantly belittle you or cast you as the scapegoat, the best revenge is not explosive anger, but silent, unshakable success. True power comes from building your own independence and trusting your unique potential, even when no one else does. You do not have to accept the diminished role assigned to you by others. By stepping out of their toxic shadow and securing your own foundation, you can rewrite your story and become the unapologetic hero of your life. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering journeys of self-discovery.